Hello and welcome to the France 24 debate. I'm Mark Owen. Tonight we're examining the deal that will bring home at least 50 hostages held by Hamas. It includes a 4-day ceasefire. Those who are to be released are women and children. And just to remind you, Israel's military says there are some 236 hostages in captivity. Some reports still cite 250 as the number held, all snatched by Hamas during a cross-border raid on October the 7th. And of course, at the same time, Hamas committed horrific atrocities on what were mostly Israeli civilians. The human cost of the Israel-Hamas war has already seen 14,000 Palestinian civilians killed. Among that number, some 6,000 children. These figures come from the Hamas-run Gaza Health Ministry. They also run the hospitals that have been targeted by Israel's military, who say Hamas operatives and control centers are based underneath those premises in much talked about tunnels. So we have a situation here where a deal is about to be clinched, we understand. It's been given the okay in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem. It's being discussed now in Qatar. We, of course, will wait to see how that goes. But many people are crossing their fingers that this happens, but also thinking about what happens to the other hostages who will still be in captivity. Our guests to discuss the issues are here in the studio, Jean de Gliniasti, who's Director of Research at the French Institute for International and Strategic Studies, also referred to as IRIS. And Jean is the former French General Consul to Jerusalem. Thank you, sir, for being with us. Pleasure to have you in the studio, as always. Joining us from New York, we have Christopher O'Leary, Senior Vice President of Global Operations for the Soufan Group. Christopher is former FBI counterterrorism senior leader and US Government Director of Hostage Recovery. Christopher, thank you for being with us here on France 24. We appreciate it, sir. In Tel Aviv, Alon Pinkas is ambassador, former chief of staff to 4 foreign ministers, former political advisor to Shimon Peres and Ehud Barak, which by my recollection, that means former political advisor to 2 former Israeli prime ministers. And Alon, I'm pleased to say, once again, a guest here in the debate. It's a pleasure to see you, sir. Thank you very much indeed. And we'll be joined by another guest later in the program. I shall keep that identity secret for now. Just in case, well, to keep the pot boiling, as it were. Gentlemen, thank you for being with us. The situation, as we have it, then we're awaiting news on the confirmation of the hostage deal, but it appears to be a done deal in that sense. Jean, can I start with you here in the studio? What is your sense about the real significance of this moment?
Well, obviously it's a very, very good news. And not only because the hostages are freed, some of them at least, but because I think it's the first coin in the slot of a new process, because I feel that the Israeli government needs some kind of face-saving device to bring a ceasefire. And of course, the official position is no ceasefire, but once you have a 4-day truce and another one to free some more hostages and so on, you are entering a new process.
Jean, have you been shocked that this process, this whole war, has been going on for as long as it has? I'm thinking back to when there was a war with Hezbollah back in 2005, 2006. The precise year escapes me just for this moment in time, but when images of children being killed were on national news, international news channels, that was when that all brought an end to that particular conflict. This time, that doesn't appear to have changed anybody's opinion. It still continues.
Yes, well, and now there is even more bombing just before the truce. It's true that the international pressure for the first time is exerting some action on the Israeli government, especially because we know that in America the opinion is changing. So I think all these children you were mentioned, unfortunately, but they play a role in the change in the Israeli attitude.
Indeed, 6,000 children dead according to the Hamas figures. Alon Pinkas, can I bring you in from Tel Aviv for your take on the situation? I mean, clearly, just sitting completely on the fence now, any news that on the one side the shooting will be stopping, on the other side people are being freed, is clearly good. But it's far more complicated than how I'm reading it, isn't it?
Yes, well, it's far more complicated on several levels. One, and most importantly, this is a partial deal. These are 50 hostages. God bless them, but these are just 50 out of 239. So we're not done on that issue. Second, the ceasefire that is attached to the agreement is said to be for 4 days, a duration of 96 hours. So the big question is, A, will it stand and be maintained and rather than violated by either side or both sides? More importantly is B, what happens on the 5th day, on the 96th hour and 1 minute? Does war resume as if nothing happened? Israel says yes. Hamas says yes. But what happens if on the 4th day Hamas says, well, you know, if we extend a ceasefire by another 4 days or 5 days, then we have another deal to offer you. And that puts everything in a very precarious, a very precarious situation, even far more complex. So what I will be looking at right now is what happens on the 5th day to seriously assess whether there is an ongoing war and this is just a hiatus, or whether there are more deals to be made.
Indeed, 50 hostages could be coming back. Fingers crossed that happens. It still leaves, Alon, some 190, depending on the figures, and there is some debate about how many there are, but let's say it leaves 190 still in captivity.
Absolutely. Look, in Israel, in the first days after that devastating Saturday of October 7th, there was a concept or an idea that says, all right, let's try and strive for a grand deal. Everyone for everyone, meaning all 240, that was the initial assessment, all 240 Israeli hostages in exchange for every and any Palestinian prisoner or a terrorist incarcerated in Israel. Now, that obviously was a deal that wasn't made and wasn't seriously considered. I don't know that anyone truly worked in that direction. But if you subtract the 50, you're still looking at 190, roughly 190 hostages. And if you subtract the soldiers, which we assume Hamas will not free, then you still have several dozens of civilians and non-combatants and people with dual citizenships. And so a resumption of the war also, and according to one analysis, endangers them.
Alon Pincus for now. Thank you very much indeed, and thank you for those opening remarks. Let's bring in Christopher O'Leary on the angle of hostage recovery, sir. I see here you're US Government Director of Hostage Recovery. What's your take on the situation? Is this the right thing to be doing?
I have a slightly different opinion. I do think it's the right thing to be doing near term. The recovery of any hostage is a victory. You know, these women and these children are going to get home to their families. They're going to get out of a horrific situation. But as was already highlighted, this is only a very small piece of a much broader problem. I think where the friction comes in moving forward is, you know, as was just pointed out, what do you do with the IDF members? Those are going to be the most difficult to get out. That negotiation, if we just rely on negotiations, could take years. Ceasing any military operations long term does not benefit, in my opinion, Israel. I think the opportunity to recover hostages is likely increased with ongoing pressure against the Hamas network. And as you proceed through Gaza, you're gathering information, you're gathering intelligence. Every apartment that you go into, you're collecting information. Every detainee that you take, you do tactical interrogations of, and you're gaining information. So that's helpful. What you're also getting with these hostages being released is after they get their medical and psychological screenings, there will be debriefs done on them as well. And any piece of information that is gleaned from them could corroborate existing information, or it could start to lead to start another intelligence focus to start illuminating where the hostages may be.
Okay, so there's much to be learned from the 50 or so that may be released. In terms of those that are still left there, Christopher, do you feel that their situation is any more secure or even more risky, given what might happen after the truce expires?
My assessment would be it doesn't change at all. Hamas, this is part of their modus operandi. Hostage taking is a tried and true method for terrorist groups, and it's successful in asymmetric warfare. One only has to look at Black September, a Palestinian group carried out the horrific hostage taking and massacre of Israeli, athletes in 1972 in Munich. And then just 2 years later, Yasser Arafat was speaking on the floor of the UN General Assembly. So they understand that this tactic works. It's drawing attention to the Palestinian cause. It's also buying them time during that time that they're purchasing with these hostage deals, these episodic releases. The international community support of Israel is eroding. Here in the United States, the blanket support for Israel in the beginning has now seriously eroded. There's fractures within the U.S. support. Domestically, you have a fissure between the hostage families and those who want justice, for what happened on October 7th. So the domestic political situation in Israel, makes things very difficult as well. Hamas
how much of
takes all this into
How much of the
calculation.
change, Christopher, in the US is down to the fact that so many children have been killed in the airstrikes and the ground offensive in Gaza?
Absolutely. Those images are horrific. Having been in counterterrorism operations my entire life, I know the United States does very discretionary targeting. I'm not sure what's happening right now. From the images, it looks like Israel has not been as disciplined as I know they can be, and they traditionally have been. But that's a concern, and that's why they're losing public support in the United States and around the world.
Christopher O'Leary, thank you for the moment. Please stay with us. Let's get some sense of what people are saying in Israel. These street interviews filmed a little earlier on the streets of Tel Aviv.
On one hand, I'm really happy that the hostages are coming home. On the other hand, I have mixed feelings because there are still many that remain kidnapped, and we don't know how, when, or at what stage they'll come back.
It's not enough, and this agreement is according to their terms. They'll do as they please, bring back mothers without their children or with only one child, leaving behind all the fathers. These are our people. We need to bring them all back. It should be our agreement according to our terms.
Two voices from the streets of Tel Aviv, I think reflecting what we've been hearing so far in the debate. And of course, that human story, John, can I bring you back in on this one again, Jean de Gliniasti? That human story about what happens next, of course, is in everybody's heart and in everybody's head. That's that fear. And I think from both perspectives, because I'm not taking sides here, but you've got to see people are dying in Gaza, the hostages are being held, there's been the atrocities committed on October the 7th, which were appalling by Hamas. But also what's been going on in the Gaza Strip is shocking people. And as Christopher was just saying, it's making Israel lose support in the United States, which would have been unthinkable before October the 7th. So there's this whole human aspect going on, which, again, you've got to think how this is playing in Israel, I suppose, because the likes of Benjamin Netanyahu perhaps are seeing their political capital crumble in what is going on.
Well, I think up to now, the priority of Netanyahu was to destroy Hamas in Gaza. Although, of course, we know that he started negotiations to release the hostages from the beginning. But the priority was to destroy Hamas.
And he said that many times, destroy Hamas, that's the objective.
Destroy Hamas. I think he already obtained some results. There is no more rockets on Ashkelon or Sderot. And I think mainly the Hamas military structure in Gaza has been destroyed. So now we can start putting the priority on the hostage question. But I think the big question is to what political results? We have no political negotiations, we have no political scope up to now, because we know that the two-state solution is not viable anymore, because you have at least 500,000 settlers in Cisjordania, in the West Bank, and so nobody knows where we are going. And I think it will be a very difficult task for our diplomats from now on.
And as your previous role as Consul General in Jerusalem, I mean, you have a real sense of the differing views and how emotional the situation is, regardless of what has just happened and what is happening.
Well, at that time, we were all enthusiastic. We all believed in the two-state solution. Now we're at a loss. We must say the truth.
Jean, thank you. Let's go back to Alan Pinkas in Tel Aviv. Alan, as a former advisor to two Israeli Prime Ministers, Perez, Barak, if you were face-to-face with Netanyahu, what would you say?
Resign.
Simple as that.
I imagine you want me to elaborate on that, but
if you could, sir.
I would begin with resign. But seriously, look, Mr. Netanyahu has an impossible task in front of him. He is a right-wing politician with an extreme right-wing coalition, facing 3 indictments and following 10 months of public resentment and pushback on a constitutional coup that he launched that was only stopped because of the tragic events of October 7th. So looking forward, he has very little options. He doesn't want to reoccupy Gaza, but he has absolutely no vision on what will and should happen on the day after in Gaza. Who should govern Gaza? I mean, we can all talk, and I support that, but we can all talk endlessly about destroying Hamas, obliterating Hamas, eradicating Hamas, annihilating Hamas, decapitating Hamas, degrading Hamas, and whatever synonym or euphemism you choose. But the question remains, and then what? Okay, so let's assume that the war resumes the day after the ceasefire. And let's assume that Israel operates in the southern part of Gaza, which until now Israel has not. It's only been limited to the northern part of Gaza, including Gaza City, which is relatively in the north. And then what? He's facing an untenable situation, even if I give him the credit, which I do not, if I give him the credit that he wants some kind of political solution. Now, his problem, let me just add one more thing. The problem is that not only was he surprised and devastated by the attack, but that the military means are not aligned with any political objective. This is something that the Biden administration has been pushing him to say, and all he can say under duress was, well, I will not allow the Palestinian Authority to extend its governance into Gaza. Fine. If not the Palestinian Authority, who then? Which is why I think the moment the war ends, and it's a very vague definition of what exactly constitutes the end of the war, he's either going to be facing political turmoil or an early election. So I would not expect anything from him, which is why, back to your question, I wasn't joking. I would advise him to cut your losses and resign.
Alan, I took you completely seriously. I was just interested to get that elaboration, which you've expertly provided to us. This deal, apparently, according to our correspondent in Jerusalem, Iris Makler, who's been following everything from day one, and we rely on for great clarification, and she never fails. Apparently, this deal was on the table 2 weeks ago. Should this have been acted on earlier by Netanyahu, do you think?
Yes, I think it was due to American pressure. I think Mr. O'Reilly referred to it previously that with the loss or the erosion of support for Israel in the U.S., I'm not talking about France or Japan or the Netherlands or South Africa, in the U.S., the pressures that the Biden administration has been under from within the Democratic Party and without from the public opinion surveys pushed the Biden administration to pressure Netanyahu into this deal weeks ago. And I think Netanyahu could have resolved to do so. But he needed, apparently in his mind, he needed some military achievements, some military accomplishments to pursue that. Whether he got them or not, I don't know. There's no question that Hamas has been military and significantly degraded. But does this constitute a win? No. Should he have seriously considered this deal 2 weeks ago? Absolutely.
Alan Pincus, bear with us. Thank you very much indeed for joining us from Tel Aviv. Alan Pincus staying with us. We have another guest who's just joined us from New York, Robert Manunkin, who is, from Boston. Excuse me, joining us from Boston. Robert Manunkin, Harvard Law School. That's the clue that should have said Boston, obviously. Author of Bargaining with the Devil, When to Negotiate, When to Fight. Robert, thank you for being with us. I'll come back to you in a second. I'm going first to Christopher O'Leary, former FBI counter-terrorism senior leader, US government director on hostage recovery, senior vice president for global operations of Sufan Group. Christopher, thank you for being with us. We listened to what you said earlier about the erosion of support. Clearly, the images of dead children coming out of the Gaza Strip has been very key in that. The capital that Netanyahu had with the United States, clearly that is being eroded. What happens next, you think, in terms of how the country develops, how the relationship with America remains? Does it advance? Is it diminished? What will happen next, do you think?
I don't think it changes significantly. I think the general public, much like the Arab Street, the American public is very emotional, and seeing these horrific images without knowing the history for most Americans, understanding the Arab-Israeli conflict, without knowing much about who Hamas or Palestinian Islamic Jihad is, or Hezbollah, or Kataib Hezbollah, or the Houthis. They're just reacting from the images. Politically speaking, the United States government is still very close with Israel. Working together to free the hostages is unquestionable. We have an incredibly strong relationship. There are few countries in the world, and I would certainly include France in that value their citizens as much as the United States and Israel. Being a citizen of our countries is important. We will do everything to protect you. If you're a hostage, we will expend every resource to recover you safely, no matter how long it takes. And I am sure that Israel is committed to that. And I know that they have the unwavering support of the United States in that continued effort.
Okay, so that's not going to change. That won't change at all.
That will not change.
In terms of getting those other hostages out, Christopher, I mean, as Alan was saying earlier, what happens on day 5? Once we've had the 4-day truce, what happens on day 5? Do you see some kind of military operation to get those hostages out? Would that be completely ill-advised?
I don't think it would be ill-advised. You're always planning in any hostage recovery, you're going to negotiate. But remember, you're negotiating with a terrorist organization, so you cannot ever completely rely on what they're promising you. You're building parallel lines of effort while you're doing that. You're constantly looking to shore up your intelligence picture, looking for opportunities to do raids to develop your information, looking for the location where the hostages may be, getting a pattern of life of the hostage takers, understanding what the composition of the building may be, and rehearsing your rescue. All the while, you have planned for an extremis hostage rescue should you get a time-sensitive trigger that gives you the opportunity to go now, and it's a fleeting opportunity.
What's your thoughts on the fact that there are believed to be so many hostages still alive, given how much the Gaza Strip has been pounded? Clearly, the hostages must be in different places to the ones that are being hit.
Listen, I think that would be a fair assumption, but I don't think we can say that conclusively. I have been involved in counterterrorism operations in urban environments throughout the Middle East. It is not difficult to secrete people in tunnels and other caches, but people have talked about, well, is this similar to Fallujah? I've been in Fallujah doing operations. It is much worse than Fallujah. People have likened it to Mosul. That's probably a better comparison, but as a former U.S. Marine, I will compare it more to Iwo Jima, where the Japanese engineers had years to prepare tunnels in volcanic rocks. So your naval gunfire and your airstrikes for weeks before the invasion had no effect on anything underground. So when the Marines landed, they took horrific losses because the Japanese were still a very capable fighting force and took almost no losses. That is my concern about Hamas, that they have not been degraded significantly militarily because they have such expansive reinforced underground tunnels. But it also gives me comfort that the hostages are more likely than not in a very safe location.
Christopher, thank you for that series of clarifications. It really is interesting to get that kind of take on the situation and that kind of insight. Thank you. Now, let's get to our guest who's just joined us from Boston, Robert Manin, a Harvard Law School professor, author of Bargaining with the Devil, When to Negotiate, When to Fight. Robert, I delayed coming to you to give you a sense of what people are saying so you can kind of warm yourself up to join the debate. But the floor is open to you now, sir. What is your sense of the situation? What do you think will happen? What should happen? Give us how you see things.
Well, I think what is happening now is promising in that it looks like there are going to be a significant number of hostages released. And it also appears that as part of this deal, after the initial release of 50, there may be some more who will be released, provided the pause is extended on a proportionate basis. What I think, two things, though, bear emphasis. First, Israel puts an extremely high priority over securing the release of its hostages. But Israel also has another objective, and that is to remove Hamas from power in the Gaza Strip. So I think it exceedingly likely that after the pause, whether the pause is 4 days or 8 days or 10 days, fighting will resume. I also think it's very unlikely that Hamas will engage in trades for all the hostages, because if they do, they would have lost what they perceive of as leverage in terms of at least securing pauses. I don't think there's going to be a ceasefire. I don't think the Israelis are willing to have a ceasefire because of their objective. And I don't think the United States is in any way pressing Israel to have a ceasefire. The other thing that's happening, though, that is promising is there looks like there's going to be a more significant amount of humanitarian aid that reaches Gaza. And that's altogether a good thing.
Robert, thank you very much indeed. Let's take a look now at the case of the soldier kidnapped by Hamas in 2006 and how that changed Israel's approach to such cases. Gilad Shalit, a teenage recruit to the Israeli military, was snatched on the Gaza border.
This image of Gilad Shalit as he returned to Israel after 5 years in captivity has become the symbol of Israel's hostage policy. Whether civilians or soldiers, hostages must return home, no matter the cost. Kidnapped in 2006 during a cross-border attack, then 19-year-old French-Israeli soldier Gilad Shalit was imprisoned by Hamas in Gaza for 5 years, until his release in October 2011, in exchange for over 1,000 Palestinian prisoners. During those 5 years, his family and the organizations supporting them kept reminding the government of its obligation.
The government sent Gilad to fight. It must bring him back.
This type of hostage policy was already applied on 2 occasions in the mid-80s. In 1983, 6 Israeli soldiers were exchanged for 4,000 Palestinians, and in 1985, 3 Israelis were freed for over 1,000 prisoners. But Gilad Shalit's case was groundbreaking. Never before in Israel's history had a single soldier been exchanged at such a high price. For his return, 1,027 Palestinian prisoners were liberated. The 5-year-long negotiations were difficult, beginning in early 2007 through Egyptian and German mediation. The main stumbling block, the selection of the individual prisoners. Successive Israeli governments ruled out the release of certain detainees on Hamas's proposed list, deemed to have, quote, blood on their hands. Notably Marwan Barghouti, former leader of the Fatah party in the West Bank, and Ahmed Sadat, Secretary General of the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine. Yahya Sinwar, however, was one of those released. 12 years later, he would become the Hamas leader behind the October 7th attacks.
Questions, doesn't it? Who will the Palestinian prisoners be? What will the profile of those prisoners be? But to begin with, now I'd like to sort of get views from the panel about this reaction, Jean, over Gilad Shalit, which was a real, we've got to get him back at all costs. I was taken aback at the beginning, October the 7th, October the 8th, when it was like, let's actually start bombing the Gaza Strip, even though the hostages are there. Now, having heard Christopher O'Leary's remarks about tunnels and safe secretion of people, maybe I understand more now. But were you shocked by how Israel went about hitting Gaza, even though the hostages were there?
Well, the fact is that the balance of prisoners released is less favorable to the Palestinians. As you know, there are now more than 6,000 prisoners, Palestinian prisoners in Israeli jails, and one-third on judgment, one-third waiting for a judgment, and one-third on administrative custody. And, well, 150 is very few. A small number compared with the prisoners. So the negotiation is hard, and the lessons from the Gilad released has been taken by the Israeli government.
Alon, can I bring you in from Tel Aviv on this issue? The profile of the Palestinian prisoners that could be released. Can you give us some take on that, some insight on that?
Well, so my understanding is that we're talking about 150 prisoners, most of which have been incarcerated, arrested. Some have been tried, some haven't, in the last 6 to 12 months. So we're not looking at veteran terrorists in Israeli jails. Many of those, perhaps the majority, are from the West Bank rather than from Gaza. True. Which is an important issue in and of itself, because Hamas is trying to challenge the Palestinian Authority in Gaza and in the West Bank, and releasing prisoners who are originally from the West Bank in Hamas's eyes strengthens their position as the real militant force in Palestinian society. I don't know. I mean, I've seen that Israel released a list of names, most of which, obviously 99% of which mean nothing to me. But looking at the charges that were placed against them, most are terrorists that have been captured in the last 6 to 12 months. We're not looking at whales. We're looking at guppies here.
Alon, thank you very much indeed. Let's take a look then at one particular case of a Palestinian prisoner.
Isra El-Jaabis was one of the prisoners Palestinians wanted to see released from her Israeli jail. Wounded in the explosion of her car in 2015, her name is on the list of prisoners, mainly minors and women, who could be freed in exchange for the release of dozens of Israeli hostages, mainly children and some women. It's estimated that some 7,000 Palestinians are detained in Israel on security grounds. Palestinians say they are political prisoners. That's 2,000 more than before the October 7th Hamas massacre. Among those prisoners, several dozen women and more than 150 youths, aged mainly 16 to 18. The Abu Maria family is one of many waiting anxiously for the release of their son.
Of course, I'm very happy because I lived through this myself in 2004, and I was part of a prisoner exchange deal with Hezbollah. My family were delighted at the time, and today I'm also very happy to hear this news that our sons and daughters in the occupation's prisons will be released from the grip of the occupation, which pressures them on a daily basis, facing humiliation.
Since October 7th, the Israeli parliament voted a temporary arrangement which allows prisons to detain more people. Jails can take in new prisoners even after they've reached full capacity. This violates a law on prisoners' rights, which includes the minimum space they're entitled to get. Prisoners have been released to house arrest so that more security prisoners could be detained. Hamas and Israel could continue swapping hostages and prisoners after the initial deal is pushed through.
surely sip on with that report. Back to Alan Pincus in Tel Aviv. Alan, has Israel been too heavy-handed in terms of how it's approached arrest and detention of Palestinians? I'm thinking of the fact that so many women are involved, so many youngsters between 16 and 18. Has Israel been too heavy-handed?
You know, on an individual case, probably not heavy-handed. These are people who have committed crimes of terrorism, of subversion, and so on. But if you broaden the lens, if you look at it from a wider perspective, this entire unsustainable situation of an ongoing 57-year-old Israeli occupation of the West Bank, and until 2005 of Gaza as well, would obviously lead you to think that Israel is heavy-handed. And so again, you know, per an individual who committed certain crimes, no, Israel has a good case against any and every one of them. Taken as a whole, this is an unhealthy and a very burdensome situation, because 7,000 are in jail now. And so what's going to happen in the next 10 years? Another 7,000 and another 7,000 without a political resolution. So, yeah, you know, again, you could say it's heavy-handed on a macro-political level. On an individual basis, no.
Alan Pincus, thank you. Let's bring in Christopher O'Leary from New York. In terms of the situation, Christopher, as we're seeing it, Alan pointing out there's 7,000 Palestinians in jails, numerous crimes. Alan pointing out many of them involved in terrorist activity. Now, some Palestinians would say some of them weren't. This is part of the argument and part of the big issue, isn't it? Sort of just exactly who these prisoners are, what the profile is. How do you feel? How comfortable are you with the concept of the prisoner exchange?
You know, not comfortable, but it's one of these necessary evils that you need to do to secure the release. Israel established this practice years ago, and Hamas knows it. They're anchored in, this in their negotiations now. You cannot tell Hamas, if you're Israel, that we don't exchange for prisoners, because they know that well. Going back just a couple of years ago, using the Qataris as an intermediary, we were negotiating with the new Taliban government and the Haqqanis for the release of an American. Our initial stance with the Afghans was we do not do exchanges. Unfortunately, some of the people we were negotiating with were actually exchanged for in previous administrations. So they know full well the United States does do prisoner exchanges as well. That's what Israel's dealing with now. There's no way around it. You just need to take the win with the 50 hostages released, reset, prepare for what you're going to do next. And as some of the guests were highlighting, what are you going to do if you defeat Hamas? Who's going to take over the Gaza Strip? Is it the Palestinian Authority? But then the broader question, which Alon was just highlighting, how do you defeat the ideology? All these losses in Gaza, you're creating two more generations of people who are going to be radicalized with an anti-Israeli ideology.
And this is the kind of thing, I think, and I'd be interested to get your opinion on this. When Antonio Guterres of the UN talked about this didn't happen in a bubble, he got a lot of criticism from certain people internationally. But I think that's what he's getting at, that you have this issue of the ongoing problems which generation on generation create what has happened now. Would you agree with that?
I would agree in part. Here's the issue. I'm a career counterterrorism professional. We in the United States have tried hard power to counter terrorism for the last 2 decades. Al-Qaeda was roughly 400, members before September 11th. Now there are roughly 40,000 members in 24 countries now. ISIS has a mirror image of that enterprise. So strictly hard power does not work. You need to have a balance of soft power, strategic approaches to, address the push-pull factors that force people to terrorism. And you need to also, cut off the head of the beast as well. You still need to be able to conduct counterterrorism operations, but there needs to be a balance. What's going on in the West Bank and Gaza has slightly different issues with it, but you need to find out what the right mix is, because clearly Israeli counterterrorism efforts sustained over these years have not, killed the ideology.
Christopher, thank you. Back to Boston, Robert Manunkin. Harvard Law School professor, author of Bargaining with the Devil, When to Negotiate, When to Fight. Robert, thanks for bearing with us. The floor's over to you now in terms of what you think about this current situation. And clearly we're hearing that there is going to be an ongoing problem with the ideology. There obviously are perils in trying to mount an operation to free the hostages that will be left. And of course, we've got to cross our fingers and hope that things work for the truce. And that issue, of course, very much on the table right now as we're discussing it. Where do you think we go next? What do you think happens next?
Well, I think what's going to happen next is the war is going to be resumed. I agree, though, that a terrible problem is what one could characterize as the day after. Assume that, in fact, the leadership of Hamas now is decapitated or put out of business. The issue of who is going to administer Gaza is almost an impossible one. None of the Arab states want responsibility for it. Egypt was offered Gaza when Begin negotiated with Sadat. They have no interest in having responsibility for Gaza, although historically there was a period when they did have a responsibility. Nor does the Palestinian Authority have the capacity for administering Gaza. And indeed, it's deeply unpopular because of the level of corruption. For the Israelis to have to occupy Gaza is also a nightmare for Israel. It's going to take an enormous number of troops who are then acting as policemen. It's a task they don't want. And in fact, the Sharon government left Gaza because Israel didn't want to have the responsibility for 2 million Palestinians living in Gaza. Now, the tragic situation is, though, that I completely agree that the only long-term solution is a political resolution. My own belief is it should be a two-state resolution. But the difficulty with a two-state resolution is, first, on the Palestinian side, there is no political leadership today capable of implementing such a deal. Or Hamas doesn't want such a deal. Indeed, they're ideologically committed to the destruction of Israel. So it's rather hard for people to argue after they've had the loss of over 1,000 civilians by terrorists invading the south of Israel, that you should negotiate with Hamas about a long-term political resolution. Because unless they change their ideology and their stance, which seems very unlikely, they're not a very good candidate to negotiate with. At the same time, the Israeli right, of course, is vehemently opposed to the idea of a two-state resolution. And Netanyahu, although at times he's been lukewarm towards it, has done nothing affirmatively to make it possible. So the bargaining situation for the long-run political solution, which is essential, first of all, it's some distance off in the future at best. And second, it's not clear there's the political leadership on either side to do it. Now, the one hopeful thing is I think Netanyahu is through. I think once the war is over, at least currently, it appears overwhelmingly likely that Netanyahu is out of power. His approval rating presently is, about 20%, extremely low. But I think the long-term, the intermediate run, this is not the beginning of a peace process, in my view. This is a process in which some of the hostages are going to be released. I very much hope and pray that many more end up being released. I'm very skeptical, though, that there's going to be a deal soon for the release of all the hostages, because Hamas wants to use them as leverage. I also think one bit of good news is, and it was suggested a little bit by the earlier speaker, for Hamas, these hostages are an extremely valuable, forgive the expression, commodity. They have an enormous incentive to protect their lives. And although you're right that given the bombing and the on-the-ground hostilities, some may inevitably die. I think it's unlikely that very many are going to die because of the Israeli war efforts. Not only because the Israelis, of course, don't want to kill hostages, but also because I think for Hamas, they're such a valuable asset.
Robert, thank you very much indeed. We need to end it here. Thank you so much. Robert Nukin from Harvard Law School, author of Bargaining with the Devil, When to Negotiate, When to Fight. Thank you to Alan Pincus, joining us from Tel Aviv, former advisor to 2 Israeli prime ministers. Always appreciate your input. Thank you, sir. Thank you to Christopher O'Leary, former FBI counter-terror senior leader and US government director on hostage recovery. And thank you to Jean de Glignasti here in the studio from the Institute for International and Strategic Affairs, and also former Consul General in Jerusalem. Thanks to you all for being with us. Thanks to you all for watching too. Stay with us. More to come here on France 24.